So, without further ado, please can I ask Eleanor to take the floor? It's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. So thank you very much for giving your time. Eleanor.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully get up some images. So just bear with me while I do that. And then hopefully you can see my presentation. Fingers crossed. There we go. So, yes, thank you for, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me this evening. It's really fantastic to be able to talk to you tonight about the archaeology of Ullswater, an area that is archaeologically rich and has evidence covering most of the major periods of our past. In putting this talk together, I thought long and hard about how to present it to you. But I actually think that chronologically, working our way through from the very beginning, when the end of the last ice age occurred around 12,000 BC, and working our way through to the present is actually easier and kind of makes more sense. Some of the sites I'm going to talk about could be a whole lecture in themselves. So inevitably, I won't be able to talk in detail about them for very long if I'm going to give you a very broad idea of how the valley has developed over 14,000 years. Hopefully, though, what will become evident is that this area of the Lake District has a wealth of archaeology and much more to be discovered if we look. Although I've said that doing the talk chronologically is easier, looking at different periods in their order, I do need to recognise that we shouldn't always be fixated on particular time periods and whether a site fits into that period or not. Archaeologists like to have clearly defined time eras, but inevitably, it's not always that simple in practice. People in the past didn't stop using stone tools in exactly 800 BC with the advent of the use of bronze, and they themselves weren't aware that they were living in a Bronze Age. With modern dating methods, it's clear that many settlement sites have been reused over hundreds, if not thousands of years, and adapted for the people to use at that time. One of the big themes that you will find that emerges from this talk is a lack of survey and modern excavation and dating of sites. For various reasons, the Lake District has had few excavations in recent times, which means that we interpret sites as being from a certain period based on their form, their morphology, and similarity to sites which have been excavated elsewhere. I'm hoping that over the next 10 years or so, we can change that. And by attracting research from universities and community groups, for example, we can begin to date significant sites in the Lake District and really demonstrate the significance of this area's archaeology. I also mentioned a lack of survey. Well, only 30% of the whole of the national park has been surveyed archaeologically. By this, I mean walkover and identification survey to see if any archaeological sites can be identified on the surface. In the Ullswater area, we are lucky. There has been some survey. The National Trust has surveyed its holding in Hartsop, and there has been some survey around Glencoyne and Askham Fell. But there are large areas that have not been looked at systematically yet. So there is the potential to increase our knowledge further. And as Tim mentioned earlier, I'm very keen to involve local communities in doing that themselves. Most of the images that you'll see in this talk are from Ullswater. I've only used images from elsewhere in the Lake District where we haven't got examples here or we haven't found sites yet. So without further ado, we'll get cracking and start looking at some of this wonderful archaeology. And we'll start with the Paleolithic period, so the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 BC. And immediately you will probably notice that this slide isn't Ullswater, or anywhere in the Lake District for that matter. It is a picture of a Norwegian tundra landscape. And It's just there to demonstrate what it probably would have been like here as the ice receded around about 14,000 years ago. There would have probably been small bands of hunters roaming the landscape, and we've got evidence of flint hand axes, bone tools, for example, harpoon points. But in the Lake District, the first evidence that we have of this appears in caves in the southern lakes, unfortunately not up around here, and in caves like Low Lindale Cave and Kirkhead Cave near Alethwaite, which is near Grange over Sands. As we move further on then into the Mesolithic period, again, we have little evidence here. Most of the knowledge that we have comes from an excavation at Monk's Moss and Escamiles on the west coast of Cumbria. The evidence is showing larger groups of hunters and gatherers using temporary settlements. They're exploiting the west coast, travelling up and down that coast using boats in that period from 8 to 4000 BC. And this picture shows you probably dates how long ago that excavation was there over on that west coast and the need for more recent work. There is lots of evidence of flint scatters at this time, and we have flint scatters from the west coast, but also in areas of the Eden Valley, with prolific work done by the Cherries at that time. But as I said, there are few finds in the interior of the lake. Most of the flints you can see on this screen come from the west coast. However, we know of 7 flint flakes found in Matterdale, and the origin of that flint is probably from outside Cumbria. So it is being brought into the Lake District, and it could date from the Mesolithic period, but also potentially into the Neolithic and Bronze Age as well. We also know of a 3 centimetre long flint flake found in Hartsop, but unfortunately I don't have much detail on that one. So this slide, as I said, shows some of the flints that have been found in Cumbria, and the bottom shows a reconstruction of a potential arrow using the flint there of what they would have looked like to hunt. As we move into the Neolithic period, we start to see the first evidence of agriculture and more permanent settlement. And we see the building of monuments in the landscape. So we're seeing stone circles like at Castlerig, Swinside, Elver Plain, and the one at the cockpit at Moordivec on Askham Fell. This one has 27 standing stones. The tallest is just under 1 metre in height. But we have had no excavation at this site. So we think it probably fits into this later Neolithic period, but it could well move into the Bronze Age as well. There's also a stone circle on Swarth Fell near Lode Pot Hill. It's supposed to be the highest stone circle in the country, with around 81 fallen stones, which is an exceptionally large number, considering that a large number have been removed from the western side. It's very difficult to photograph this site, and I have to apologise that I haven't got a good one to show you. So that's something that I've put on my list to go and trek up there to go and have a look at and see if I can find and get myself a good photograph of it. Now moving on, I wanted to show you this site at Greenhow and Offatree Fell, which I know is not in Ullswater. But the reason for me putting it in is because I wanted to show you a comparison of another site that we have actually on Hallin Fell. And I thought it would be worthwhile to show you this picture as an example of what a causewayed enclosure looks like. This one at Greenhow was identified in 2000 as part of a Neolithic Industries and Enclosures project by English Heritage. Causewayed enclosures were built from around 3700 BC to 3400 BC, and they probably served as arenas for episodic communal gathering. In Devon, where one's been excavated, there was huts and storage pits within the enclosed area. And the dates, the radiocarbon dates, come back to around 3000 BC. These enclosures are amongst the oldest and rarest field monuments in Britain. And this one at Greenhow was the first to be identified in northern England. Until this one, the most northern one was in Staffordshire. So there are only a handful now that have been found in northern Britain. It's a fantastic site with panoramic views to the Solway. And this survey was carried out just to show you what the banks look like. It's a discontinuous bank and ditch. There were no evidence of finds in the centre. And you can perhaps see, can you see my mouse moving on the screen to help you identify? Yeah. These are the pieces of bank, which is how it's described as a causeway, because there are causeways between those banks where you can enter the monument. There has been no excavation on this site either. So again, we're saying that this site, we're extrapolating that it is a Neolithic causewayed enclosure because it is very similar to ones found further south. Its size, how it's positioned on the natural topography, how it's orientated towards the Solway Plain. We haven't had an excavation, but there were some finds, some flint finds by a lady called Nicola Bissett, and they were found nearby the causewayed enclosure. And this site, along with other recent discoveries in Northern Ireland, Anglesey and the Isle of Man, shows a small number of them scattered around the North Sea, the Irish Sea, sorry. And these links are true with other aspects of Neolithic archaeology, like rock art and axes, which I'll talk about later. Now, as I said, the reason for me mentioning this site is because there was another site found on Hallin Fell in Ullswater. And it was thought that this site could also be a causewayed enclosure. But I think you'll see, hopefully with some of the evidence that I show you tonight, that perhaps it isn't. And certainly some of the people surveying the site don't think it's now classed as a causewayed enclosure. So Hallin Fell, here viewed from above, was first photographed by English Heritage. And then at that time, they did think it could possibly be a causewayed enclosure. You can see, I hope, and I'm going to show you on here, the line of the enclosure wall. I'm going to bring it up in red and then I will reverse that back again so that you can hopefully see the line here of the bank that comes around here. And then possibly some more bits over here as well. Originally, the wall was known about and it was interpreted as a long, 700 metres long stretch of tumbled wall. Then it was considered to potentially be this causewayed enclosure. So there's the enclosure, and this is what it looks like on the ground. You can see this bank made up of like tumble of stone, really, and that's what stretches around Hallin Fell. With field survey by the now Historic England, it revealed that what was recognised from the air is only part of this perimeter that effectively surrounds the whole of the plateau below the summit. It's an area of more than 30 hectares, so quite a significant area. Now, this is the plan. I don't know if it's very easy for you to see this. I've rotated it to be the same shape as the aerial photograph. So hopefully you can see that this is the bank curling round that's in the same position as it was earlier, coming around here. And there's some stretches here. And it actually uses in places the natural topography of where there are scarps and screes to enclose the top of this plateau. It has been argued that with this low stony bank, incorporating the outcrops, that it was a causewayed enclosure or a tor enclosure like those found in the southwest, and would therefore have been probably pre-Iron Age in construction. But Al Oswald and Mark Edmonds have recently, in a published article, suggested otherwise, suggesting that it might be more common with later prehistoric enclosures. There are no surface features suggesting permanent inhabitation inside. There could be a link with livestock management. It's possible because all the relatively level ground of the plateau has been included, as well as the springs, natural springs. And there's also a small scatter of clearance cairns, suggesting that this is improving the pasture, removing the stones, rather than actually cultivating inside it. So as you can see, really, the jury is still out in interpreting this one. It's unlikely to be resolved without further investigation and probably excavation. But what it demonstrates is that sites in the Lake District and here in Ullswater are contributing to current debates in archaeology. And this area has a huge part to play in telling the story of prehistoric and Neolithic Britain. Cumbria is at the centre of Britain and certainly was at the centre of many pathways going across in the Neolithic period to Ireland, but also across to the east and to Yorkshire. So a really important area. In the Neolithic, we also see the appearance of larger flint tools and polished stone axes, and many of you will be aware of the famous site of axe factories in the Central Fells. We have over 300 individual sites on Langdales and also ones on Scarfell and Glaramara. Here at Top Buttress on Piker Stickle, this is the area where the band of volcanic tuff that is used to make the axes is situated. And this is what it looks like on the ground. Here at the quarry site, they would sometimes fire set against the edge to break off the axe material. And they would create what these are called rough out axes before they were taken away to be polished. Now, I had some reconstructed axes created for us a few years ago, and it took the gentleman 70 hours of polishing a rough out axe like this to create the beautiful axes. So these items were extremely significant. They weren't just practical, although of course they were used for practical things, but to take that amount of time when you are hunting, you're gathering, to stay alive, to actually create these beautiful objects, we think there is far more symbolism to them as well. The industry of all the axes shows that also there was a considerable demand for these tools, and those tools necessary to create agricultural clearances of woodland as well. So it does suggest that there were attempts in the Neolithic period to exploit the land here, the marginal land in this area, through clearance, and then possibly the introduction of farming and settlement. And these axes were traded across Britain. The map on the left there shows the distribution of those axes going all the way across Britain into Scotland and into Northern Ireland and Ireland itself as well. They are significant objects in this period, and as I've mentioned just earlier with Halling Fell, this place, this area was significant in Neolithic Britain. New radiocarbon dates show in this area of axes in Langdales that they were made around 3,800 to 3,330 BC. And they were probably losing their significance then potentially by the late Neolithic period. Therefore, they're associated with structures like long barrows, round barrows, and causewayed enclosures, and probably not associated maybe with stone circles or henge monuments like the one we know, the henge monument at Mayborough Henge, just south of Penrith, than was previously thought, because some of those sites are now being dated to being a bit later in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age period. A broken stone axe was found beneath the turf in the entrance of Mayborough Henge. So maybe the axes were already in existence, they were being used and then placed into these monuments as they were being built. At this time, we also see the creation of rock art. Now, rock art has only been discovered in the last 20 years in the Lake District, and that was with the actual finding of rock art at the southern end of Ullswater in Patterdale. It has been known across northern England, in particular in Northumberland and Durham and Yorkshire, for a number of years, but previously it was only found on monumental sites in Cumbria, for example, on stones at Longmeg and her daughters and Castlerig. but now it's found in situ in sites across the Lake District in Buttermere, Crummockwater, Grasmere and the Langdales as well. And these marks are known as cup marks. You can see on the picture the points where the stone has pecked the surface. If you look in some of these crop marks here, you can see the individual marks that the stone has made. And some of these natural striations, these kind of natural marks in the rock, have been accentuated by the cup marks. And you can see some of the marks on the side of these. We don't fully know the exact meaning of what the designs are. Some think they're possibly maps. Could they show us where to go and get the stone for axes? Are they sacred or religious symbols? We don't know, but clearly the location of the rock that is chosen for these markings is really important. And in this case, with this one at Patterdale, you can see the relationship of this rock mirroring the fell behind it. There is a slightly different style of rock art found on some boulders in the Langdales, which is very similar to Irish rock art found in chambered tombs like Newgrange. And that could certainly demonstrate more links across the Irish Sea, which were evidently important in this period as well. But we'll move on to the Bronze Age. In the Bronze Age, the climate got a lot warmer. So people were able to settle on higher ground up to about maybe 300 metres. And there was a reduction in tree cover as well. Now this slide shows a cairnfield over in the west because I had a good aerial view of it. And you can see all the individual small cairns on here where they've been clearing the landscape to make way for either agriculture or for pasture fields. You can see the individual cairns here. And although they don't look like much, they're a heap of stones, they actually are really important because the buried land surface under that cairn can potentially tell us a lot about the environment and climate in the Bronze Age period. So they are really important to know. And we do have cairnfields in Ullswater. We have them on Askham Fell, at Glencoyne and on Deepdale Common. And I'm pretty sure that if we started looking, we would find them elsewhere as well. We also have larger round cairns, which were used for burial from the late Neolithic to late Bronze Age, and these were called bowl barrows. They're earthen or rubble mounds covering a single or multiple burials in a stone-lined compartment called a kist. Sometimes they occur in isolation, like this white raised cairn on Askham Fell, but sometimes you can get them in groups. But often they occupy a really prominent location. Their cairns are a major visual element in our landscape. The one at White Raise has had limited antiquarian investigation, and they definitely located human remains. But unfortunately, we know nothing of where those remains are now and whether there were any grave goods associated with it or not. There could be further evidence in this mound of more interments, or possibly later cremation burials inserted into the mound as well. This monument lies in an area of open fell, rich in prehistoric monuments. There is an alignment of funerary monuments stretching for over 1.5 kilometres along the natural communication route over the Col between the Ullswater and Lowther valleys. So you see this natural line of communication, and in prehistory, people will have used upland routes because the lower ground was forested. It was much harder to travel. And although sometimes prehistoric routeways are difficult to define, they can often be established by the presence of distinct alignments of monuments. So in this case, on Askham Fell, there is a clear alignment of funerary cairns, standing stones, and stone avenues which are parallel rows of stones linking between the monuments. So this photo is taken with me standing on White Raise Cairn, and I'm looking over towards the Lowther Valley to Knipe Scar, and Helton is below in the dip. And this is the copstone, which some of you may well know on the land. You can clearly see it from White Raise Cairn. We also have some burial ring cairns. There's another one here, and there are these potential stone rows, although I have to say I'm not entirely convinced about them, and I'd need to have a look at them in a bit more detail. But this is a really important route with all of these monuments, and including White Raise that was stood on, that link the Lowther and Ullswater valleys. This is the copstone itself, and it's situated within a bank of a ring cairn. Antiquarian records indicate that in the mid-1880s, the bank was continuous in this location and actually contained more than 10 recumbent stones. The ring cairn itself is a potential ritual monument. We don't fully understand them, but when they've been excavated elsewhere, they've revealed pits, some that contain burials, others containing charcoal and pottery, which is taken to often indicate feasting associated with perhaps burial rites. There's also a Bronze Age cairn, like the one at White Raise, near Hartsop Hall, near the Romano-British settlement site there. So I'll talk about that a bit more later, but you can see the cairn here. We also have a number of barrows or cairns on fell summits. And these could certainly date from these periods. This one on Lodepot Hill is really quite distinct. You've obviously got this modern walker's cairn on the top, but if you can see that there's this mound here, which is probably a Bronze Age cairn on the top. We also have ones on Great Melfell and Little Melfell as well, bowl barrows there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that these cairns are situated in prominent locations, so people would have been able to see them both in prehistory and you can today. Now, finally, in the Bronze Age, the last site I wanted to talk about are burnt mounds. Burnt mounds are usually these kidney-shaped mounds of fire-cracked stone. In the centre, there would be, in this area here, a stone or clay or wood-lined pit, which we assume the water was heated in that pit using stones heated from a fire, and they were placed in to bring it to the boil, and then food was put in there to cook. So the mound, the kidney-shaped mound of stones, was created by taking the stones out of the pit and putting them to the sides. We often think they're for cooking, but there are some people who seem to suggest that potentially they could have been involved. It might have been like a sweatshop, you know, like American Indians potentially had, and maybe so they were saunas type functions, but we're not totally convinced on that idea. Now, I've put this up. There are no identified burnt mounds in the Ullswater Valley in any of the parishes in Ullswater. But we only started finding these sites in the last 10, 15 years. And again, I'm sure that if we started looking for these, I'm sure we would find them in the Ullswater Valley. So that's one that you could keep your eye out for when you're walking around the valley. So moving on into the Iron Age and Romano-British period. We call it going through into the Romano-British period into 100 AD, because although the Romans successfully invaded Britain in 43 AD, they didn't actually control this area until after about 72, 73 AD, when they built a fort in Carlisle. And certainly the forts in the Lake District weren't built and probably until around 150 AD. So the Romano-British period, Iron Age to Romano-British, covers that time when the Romans were here in Britain, but the locals probably pretty much carried on living and working in exactly the same way as they had been. The landscape in the Iron Age period would have been more open and more organised, including woodland management, and there probably would have been more agricultural settlement in the valleys as well. But here in Ullswater, there is a small hill fort located on the summit of Dunmallard Hill, and it overlooks the foot of Ullswater in a really commanding, great position to be able to see around. It's an enclosure which is defended on all of its sides by a revetted bank, in some places up to 9 metres wide and 3 metres high. It's a small example of this class of monument, but it does suggest that in this period, people were potentially felt threatened by possibly the incoming Romans maybe, and they felt the need to have to build a defensive structure in this location. We also have a defended site at Maiden Castle on the north side of Ullswater. This enclosure is approximately 65 metres in diameter. It has some internal earthworks, and these have been interpreted as house platforms. But you can see that it is defended with an outer stone rampart, a ditch, and counterscarp bank. These sorts of sites are extremely rare here. And in fact, I don't think we have a similar one elsewhere in the Lake District. And again, it suggests that there was a need for a defensive settlement site in this area at that time. One site that has been recently excavated, and well, by recently, I think it was nearly 20 years ago now, but that was the excavation that took place at Glencoyne on the north side of Ullswater. And it was a hut circle complex excavated by Helen Loney and Andrew Hone of Glasgow University. And the excavations revealed that it was a really complex site. Initially, there were agricultural layers dated to the Bronze Age. So although it wasn't a settlement site in the Bronze Age, there was definitely activity, agricultural activity, taking place on the site at that time. The occupation of the hut circle took place in the Iron Age period, and it was radiocarbon dated to around 300 BC. And it's true that a number of sites in the area demonstrate continual occupation from the late Bronze Age through to the Iron Age and into the Roman period, the Romano-British period. We know the site was in use in that Romano-British period because there were influences from the Romans found here in Samian pottery and the beautiful Roman glassware that was found there as well. And then also at the very top of this excavation, they found a potential post-Roman structure, evidence from potentially what some people call the Dark Ages. And we haven't got a huge amount of information about that, but it does suggest that these sites were continually occupied. And this is a reconstruction drawing of a Romano-British settlement and potentially what it might look like, modelled on a site over in the west at Barnscar. But you can see the circular roundhouses built of stone with the thatching on the top, and then the fields adjacent where they would have kept their animals. Ullswater has a concentration of these Romano-British settlement sites. This is one at Hartsop Hall, but there are also ones at Heckbeck in Martindale, Hagbeck in Glenamara Park, at Broomhill Plantation in Grisdale, Deepdale Hall and Deepdale Bridge. And we've started to survey some of these sites in detail, and I would certainly like to have a look at them a bit more, potentially do some excavation, investigate them further. This one at Hartsop Hall, this is in the left here is the Bronze Age cairn I showed earlier. You can see the outlying enclosure bank of the settlement site here. And internally, there are potentially at least 3, if not 5 hut circles. There's potentially one here, and one here, and possibly another one here and here. It's known locally as the Druid Circle, and it's located on the valley floor, it's located just above the valley floor, perhaps indicating that the valleys were still poorly drained at this time and potentially covered with wet woodland, so not ideal for occupation. And you can see in the survey, you've got the Bronze Age cairn at the bottom here, the enclosing bank going round, and there's the 1, 2, 3 hut circles and potentially another one here and here. Just another photo of the settlement site there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Roman presence in the Lake District was military. Forts were established in the Lake District by around 150 AD at Ambleside, and then at Ravenglass, where there was a port as well. And there's also the fort just outside the Lake District, south of Penrith at Broome. A road system was established, and the highest Roman road in England is the High Street Roman Road, which goes from Ambleside to Broome. These forts have, at Ambleside and in the Lake District, have dating evidence from around the 2nd and the 4th centuries. So it's good reason to believe that the roads were going in at those times and built then. They were an important route of communication, and this one certainly on High Street probably formalised an already known prehistoric route, because along this route we're aware of cairns that existed. I showed you the one on Lodepot Hill before, so it may well be that there was an established route. It was safer for people to walk here. There wasn't tree cover at this height. In the valleys, it was wet, it was forested, there were wild animals. So people in prehistory did walk up there, and the Romans potentially formalised those routes. We have excavated a small area of the Roman road as it heads down at Frosick down into the Troutbeck Valley, and that's Windermere beyond. The excavation revealed that the road was built of gravel and pebbles, probably not the same way as we imagine Roman roads in the lowlands. But interestingly, in each trench, there were different ways of keeping the water and the peat from the surface of the road, which is not really surprising that they had to do up here. In one trench, it was a large gravel-filled ditch, and in the other two, there was a large bank built of clay and gravel. So as I said, not typical Roman road building, but probably due to the terrain and practical requirements needed on the site. As we move into the post-Roman period, there's actually very little evidence here of what we know. And as I mentioned, some people call this the Dark Ages. But I don't think that's true. I just think we just haven't found some of the sites. We know from pollen evidence collected at Shelfwaite Hill Fort at Thirlmere that there was a major clearance of woodland in the late 6th, early 7th century, and that was happening here. And there's a picture of them doing the core work at the Hill Fort here. However, one site, and one majorly important site that we have near Ullswater, is the thought to be Anglian monastery at Dacre. Its existence was known from Bede, who wrote in the early 8th century that he mentioned a monastery being built near the River Dacor, which has taken its name from the same, because he was describing a contemporary establishment, and he also supported his detail with the names of the abbot and 2 brothers. There was considerable reliance placed on this reference. We know that Dacre was an important place in AD 926 because Athelstan received the submission of the kings of Strathclyde and Scotland, following the completion of his campaigns in the north, and the son of Constantine, the King of Scots, was summoned and baptised, and this possibly took place at the monastery referred to by Bede. Excavations took place in the 1980s, and there were a number of artefacts found dating to this Anglican period, the pre-Roman period, including iron tools, window glass, loom weights, a quernstone, bronze pins, 2 coins, stikers of dated 848 to 855 AD. There was a silver pin and a silver clasp, as well as some fragments of stone crosses, which are probably of later Norse date as well. They found a large enclosure in which the present church sits. There were traces of timber buildings and a cemetery containing at least 70 graves. The excavation at its time in the 80s revealed the first associated deposits and structures of the post-Roman to pre-Norman period in northwest England outside of Carlisle. So it's an incredibly important site. They also identified some possible prehistoric occupation here as well to the north of the church. There was evidence of lots of flint finds. Now, we've been waiting for the report on this site for a number of years now, but I am actually delighted to say that it is nearly complete. It is being peer reviewed, and I'm hoping that it will be published early next year, very soon. And it will be fantastic if it is, because this site is incredibly important and deserves full recognition. The picture on the screen shows the drain, which has been made with reused moulded stone blocks. So as we move into the Norse period, the 10th century, we know that there wasn't really a Viking invasion of Cumbria. The Vikings arrived via Ireland due to political turmoil, and there was an influx of people coming then, but they would have assimilated into the existing culture. They already had trade links with local people here, and they probably actually had to take the less favoured farms and locations that other people were not using. I mentioned the find of carved cross shafts at Dacre, and we also have crosses like the Gosforth Cross here, and hogback tombstones. But there are also 3 hogback tombstones at St Michael's Church in Lowther, and they probably date to the late 10th, early 11th century as well. Although there is a lot of archaeological evidence, although there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence, we do have the legacy of place names in Cumbria from Norse settlement. So we have names like Thwaite, the forest clearing, Beck, a stream, and Gill, a ravine or waterfall. We just really don't know much about where they lived. A shealing settlement probably originates in this period. Shealings are small, seasonally occupied huts. They were built to provide shelter for herdsmen who tended animals grazing the summer pasture on upland, reflecting a system called transhumance. So they typically were constructed, construction typically ceased around the 16th century of these, and we know that there was possibly a shealing at Glencoyne and one near Bordale Hawes. But again, I think if we actually started to survey and look for these, we would really find more. Certainly survey in the Duddon Valley that they did brought up a number of of possible shealing sites that we didn't know existed. So that leads us quite nicely into settlement in the medieval period from around 1092 to 1600. Where were the normal population living? Well, we have a lovely example of a medieval or possible medieval longhouse, because it hasn't been excavated, at Scarsgill Head, Riddingling's top, which is on Askham Fell. And this aerial photograph shows the longhouse here with an internal subdivision there and the enclosure surrounding it. Sites like this have been dated over at Bootle Fell in documentary sources to between 1250 and 1510. We also know of a longhouse at Hartsop, and it's a little bit difficult to pick out, but if you follow my mouse around, it goes in this area around here, and that's a possible medieval longhouse there as well. But significantly in the medieval period, the Normans took control of Carlisle in 1092, and the Lake District was divided up by Norman aristocracy, and large tracts were given to the monasteries, including Shap, Calder and Furness. And this was a great change to the pattern of settlement and society in northern Britain. The Shap Abbey initially was founded in Preston Patrick in 1191, but it moved to Shap in 1201. And we can't underestimate the great administrative and agricultural importance of the abbey for the region. They contributed to local industry. There was also a mill at Shap itself and a large industrial complex to the south. And they played a really important part in developing packhorse roads and routes and bridges as well, packhorse bridges. And this is a potential route in Grisdale of a packhorse route going over the fells. Another site near here from the medieval period is Dacre Castle and its moat. having its origins in the medieval period, a fortified tower house from the 14th century, with obviously later additions and alterations. It was built soon after a licence to crenellate was granted in 1307, and it's been suggested that the castle was constructed within an earlier moated site, but we haven't had that confirmed, and the surrounding moat may be contemporary with this castle. Documentary sources of 1354 indicate that Margaret de Dacre lived in the castle, and that the East Tower was built sometime before 1485 by Humphrey de Dacre. It became derelict in the latter half of the 17th century before it was made habitable again by Tom Leonard, the Earl of Sussex. But soon again in the 18th century, it suggests that it may well have been run down. There was an engraving by Book where it looks derelict, and that was also enhanced by Gilpin in 1786, who depicted the castle as a roofless ruin. Another unusual moated site appears at, south of Gale Bay on the shores of Ullswater. It's also known as Hodgson Hill on Waterside campsite. It is unusual, and I don't think there's another like it in the Lake District. It's thought to be a site where the natural feature has been enhanced, and it's levelled on the top to create a building platform where there would have been a potential manor house surrounded by a moat. According to local tradition, it's known as Tristamont, which would have been the home of Sir Tristram, one of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. But the site is actually mentioned in a 14th century document by Sir W. Strickland and his son Thomas, and we have found glazed pottery on the shore nearby, glazed medieval pottery. In a recent agri-environment scheme, we carried out some geophysical survey, and we also installed an interpretation panel on site. So all the people that camp on the lovely hummock know that they're camping now on a medieval moated manor house. And this is the picture of the reconstruction of what it potentially could have looked like. The site has suffered from erosion, and so we've been working hard to stop that happening, creating a barrier and planting trees to prevent the erosion and trying to grow some vegetation back. So the medieval period saw, with the influence of the abbeys, the development of the wool trade and iron industries. And we see large examples of charcoal burning with the earlier charcoal pits on the left from about the 13th and 14th century. And then later on, the more formal burning platforms where they would have used the poles, the coppiced poles, to burn for charcoal. You can see some images of charcoal burning here, and we certainly have examples of pitsteads in the woods on the southern edge of Ullswater, in those woodlands there. There are also lots in Glenamara Park, in Patterdale, and in woodland in Hartsop as well. And you can see how they've stacked the coppiced poles. They cover it in turf. They remove a central motty peg, and this man's placing the embers inside. And then they use the screens and a barrel of water to douse it to make sure it doesn't burn too quickly to get the charcoal. Alongside these charcoal burning platforms, we see woodsmen's huts in the woods as well, with a hearth at the back. There was simple construction and possibly would have been seasonal dwellings. And this is an example of potentially what one might have looked like that was built at Brantwood in Coniston. We also know that the charcoal was probably used for smelting iron. And in the medieval period, they would have used these iron bloomery sites called bloomeries because the iron at the bottom of the smelt was called a bloom. And you can see what these bloomery iron smelting furnaces look like here with this example one with the hand-drawn bellows. And what we have left are these large mounds of slag that we can survey with a magnetometer to identify the furnaces in situ. What I should say is that we possibly know of one bloomery site in Hartsop near Hoggart Gill, but some more work needs to be done on that to try and identify it. We also have potash kilns, and this one is at Eskdale, I think there are a couple of examples in Ullswater, but I think again with more survey we would find more. Potash kilns are where bracken was burnt, green bracken was burnt for use in the fulling process in the woolen industry. The potash that was produced was used in the soft soap or lye for fulling and scouring, cleaning the woolen cloth. And as I say, I think we should probably find more of those as well. I just wanted to briefly mention peat cutting, because I'm sure there are probably examples on the fells of peat cutting, and we can probably work out on aerial imagery where peat cutting took place. And the peat cutting spade there, an example of one. But moving finally into the post-medieval period. And in this period, there is the development of the major industries: mining, quarrying, gunpowder, bobbins, mills, tanning. It goes on. And the Ullswater Valley is rich in remains from this period. And I could have picked out many more examples. There is a corn mill at Hartsop, and there are lots of mills in the valley: bobbin mills at Howtown, Sparket Mill, Matterdale, which was a corn mill, then a sawmill. You can see the millstones here in the building, and there was a head race that came down to the water wheel which ran the mill. There's also in Hartsop a corn drying kiln, which is in the village, which is separate from the mill, which possibly suggests that this was a communal drying kiln in the village. A lot of the mills in the Lake District would have had the kilns attached. But after threshing, the oats were ready to be ground, but they were soft and fatty, and they needed to be dried and hardened before they were sent to the mill. So the lower section of the mill was where there was the kiln, and the upper bit was for drying, and the floor in between was built entirely of slate, with narrow shafts of slate slotted into the slate joists with spaces between to allow the warm air to percolate through to dry the grain above. And it's really spectacular, the one in Hartsop. We also have examples of lime kilns, this one on Askham Fell. And we also have an example of lead smelting in Hoggart Gill. This is a late 17th, early 18th century lead smelting mill. It includes the smelt mill, the building, the structure here. There are two openings, but internally the building is divided by a cross wall here, where there are traces of the smelting hearth, which is defined by these two upright stones here. And this is the area in the south here where the wheel pit would have been. This is just an example that they used a weir and a leat to take water off into the ponds and then into a race, which was then put on a wooden launder on launder supports to the mill itself. There is a large area of slag which is deposited from the smelting house here down the slope. And there's also a kiln, a wood drying kiln on the site to use the charcoal from it in the smelting process. Documentary sources say that there was permission to erect a smelt mill here at the end of the 17th century, possibly in 1696. In 1764, there is a map showing the old smelt mill, so it's possible that it had gone out of use by this time. Many of you will know Myers Head lead mine, and this is it being conserved by the National Trust. Myers Head lead mine was built in around 1870. It's an adit into the hillside here, and this is a launder system which carried the water from the river down onto a water wheel at the bottom here. The wheel drove a Cornish pump which took the floodwater out of the mine here. It was a real problem at this mine. It kept getting flooded. And actually in the late 1870s, it was really flooded and hasn't been used since. So it was only in production for about 10 years here. And finally, looking at mining remains. This is Eagle Crag Mine in Grisdale. You can see the lead vein that comes down the mountain here, which has been exploited, as well as them driving adits into the mountain and the areas of spoil. You can see this is the vein coming down here with the spoil, and there are a number of buildings on site, dates to around the 18th century. And then finally, I must mention Greenside Lead Mine. The earliest known mining here was in around the 1750s, but it could have potentially have been earlier. And if the seam outcropped on the surface, there is no reason to think that the Romans may not have used the lead from here, or even into the early medieval period. But any evidence of that has been destroyed or not yet recognised, so we can't say that for sure. But Greenside was worked continuously from 1825 to 1962, and all the ore came from a single lead vein, a mile long and 3,000 feet deep. Absolutely incredible. This is an aerial view of the site. At the top of the site, which you can see the beautiful finger dumps of material coming out from the higher level workings up here. These are the high horse level, I think, and this is the chimney that comes up the site, the flue coming up here. There were 300 people directly employed at the mine and about 52 houses built for the workers. The school and the church were first to have electricity in the country off the back of the hydroelectric plant that was built for the mine. So it had a huge impact on the village. In fact, 100 children were at the school in Patterdale when the mine closed. And to think that now, there's nowhere near that number of children. And so when the mine closed, that had again a massive impact on the village, with families moving away. The site is currently on the Heritage at Risk Register because of the state of some of the buildings and the erosion that's occurring. I've managed to get some funding from Historic England from their COVID fund, Heritage at Risk Fund, to carry out a conservation management plan at the site, which we're doing at the moment. It's going to outline the condition and the things that we have to do to get the site back into a good condition. We're also looking at an interpretation plan. Once all of the plans have been completed, we will apply for funding to carry out the conservation work and also create some interpretation, because I think that it's really important that people visiting Greenside and Glenridding realise the impact that the mining heritage had on this corner of Lakeland. I hope you have enjoyed this talk and it's made you realise the wealth of archaeology in the landscape in Ullswater. And I hope it inspires you to start looking at the landscape differently and potentially looking for some of the sites on your doorstep as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Eleanor. It was a masterful presentation and a wondrous journey through, was it 14,000 years BC to 16,000 years? It's incredible. All managed within 55 minutes or whatever it was.
Yeah, sorry, I thought it was going to be much shorter, but it is a lot to get through in that time.
No, you held everyone there. We're all in there. Well, you're willing to take some questions, I think, and I just picked up, there's one some time back from Jenny Lee talking about, Jenny, would you like to come on, unmute yourself and pose your question?
Hiya.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi, just wanting to know a little bit more about the Langdale rock art, because we've seen that and we're really quite puzzled about it. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about it, please.
Of course, yeah. Well, the Langdale rock art it's very different to the rock art that you find in Patterdale, the cup and ring marks. The Langdale rock art is compiled of spiral motifs, really, which if you've ever seen any of the chambered tombstones at Newgrange in Ireland, it's kind of very similar to that with swirls. Unfortunately, I haven't got any pictures on here that I could show you. There is a suggestion that because it's different to the cup and ring marks, it's very much more linked to Ireland, and so potentially promotes the links that there were with Ireland in those times. We know that the stone axes were going over to Ireland, and perhaps there was this link of ideas. And then that some of the other rock art is more linked to the eastern areas of Britain in terms of Northumberland and Durham and Yorkshire. I can certainly provide you with some more information, Jenny, if you'd like to have some links to some articles on the rock art. Richard Bradley recently did an excavation at the site to have a look, and they excavated by the rock art and underneath, and the motifs go underneath the current ground surface. So, so yes, they continue below the ground surface, so they are older.
Has anybody interpreted them in any, trying to interpret them?
No, well, interpretation is very difficult. As I said, very similar to motifs in Ireland, but we don't really know what they were for now. And because at Langdale there's only those ones that look like that at Langdale, it's very difficult to say for sure what they might be, for any really. And whether they were there because of the links to the Langdales. They're on prominent stones with very good view up to the Langdales and the source of stone axes between the two rocks that they're on. So there's obvious links with that, but it's very difficult to say actually what they mean. But I can certainly, if you want to contact me, I can certainly provide you with some more information.
Have they been definitely dated as being Neolithic? And how would you do that?
No, well, that's one of the issues with rock art, that it is very difficult to date it. And certainly the only way of dating it is through excavation and potentially finding the tools and things associated with the site that you might find during an excavation next to it. The way we date it is because bits of rock art look like rock art elsewhere, which have been dated in that way. But yeah, it's very difficult to definitely give it an age, I'm afraid.
But you're pretty sure that it is Neolithic?
Yeah, we hope so. Yeah, we're pretty sure it's that kind of era. Yeah.
Can I ask if anyone else has a question? Ian Jack, would you like to say something? No, it's just a comment he's made. Does anyone have any more questions? I'm going to throw one in, if you don't mind. You've made a plea. Well, you've underlined the fact that there's plenty of work that still needs to be done. And I'm just wondering if an organization like ourselves that has have many motivated people who are very willing to help and who have a specific interest in heritage. I mean, if you were to look at the vast breadth of material out there, I mean, where would you put the top priorities for people who, like us, who would be interested in doing some excavation work in the valley to help expand common knowledge? Are they one or two, three top things that we should focus on and try to engage with yourself and others to try to address?
I think thanks, Tim. That the first thing I would like to see people engage with is just this initial identification of features. You know, where are things in the landscape? So this level 1 survey of the landscape, because if I don't know where things are, I can't protect them and look after them. So for me, it's about getting out into the landscape and systematically looking at it and identifying features. And there's certainly areas that we could do that and we could target for groups to do that and find out. And our archaeology volunteer network in the Lake District is the volunteers, and they go out and do that on a regular basis. And I'm hoping that we might be able to work with you on that in the future and do some more surveys in the Ullswater Valley. So that would be my top one. I did mention about Romano-British settlement earlier as well, and there is a concentration of some amazing sites in Ullswater. None of them have been excavated and looked at, and I think my sort of second priority would be to look at them in a bit more detail, do a real detailed surveys of them, and then potentially look at possible excavation of some of those sites in the future as well. So I think that would be my top initially, to work out where sites are, and then perhaps looking at those Romano-British sites as well.
Would you be willing to just put on a piece of paper in just a couple of paragraphs? I know you're very busy. You know, those things that you think would be interesting, and then I can circulate them amongst our group and
Yeah,
see
of
if there's
course.
something that we can put our energy into.
Yeah, of course I will, Tim. Yeah, one of the things that I'm down to do, and I never quite get round to doing, is provide a kind of like research framework for the Lake District to outline those areas of research that are really needed across the Lake District, but certainly will be identified in Ullswater as well. But it's getting round to writing that, and it's all in my head at the moment. So I will certainly try and put some things down on paper for you.
Does anyone have any questions? Any hands going up? I can't see anything at the moment.
Gordon was waving.
Okay, very good. Gordon, thank you.
Eleanor, do you have an archive that anyone can access? And if you do, would you mind? Could you tell us where it might be?
Yeah, we do. We have the Lake District Historic Environment Record, which we put in all the known archaeology and historical sites in there. It's a public database, and at the moment it's available through the website called the Heritage Gateway. But we're actually updating our database in the hope that it will be made available on the Lake District National Park website itself. So that will hopefully happen later this year. But in the meantime, if you look at the Heritage Gateway, you can search on that for sites. It's not very easy to use, I admit, which is why we want to put one on our own website for people to use. So if all else fails and you're having trouble finding things, do feel free to contact me, and I can always do some searches and send them out to you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much.
Does anyone else have a question? Maybe, Eleanor, we talked before the call about a project idea that you had. If, as you know, we put 50% of any proceeds we have, revenue from this talk, to a project which we would like you to identify. Have you got any ideas about how you would like those resources to be allocated?
Yeah, Tim, one of the thoughts I had for that was to put it towards the Lake District Archaeology Volunteer Network to hopefully support them in purchasing equipment that they use and go out. And I think that would be really great, because if you are able to team up with them to do some work in the Lake District and in the Ullswater Valley, then you'll be able to see the benefits of that and use the equipment out there in the field as well.
That's a brilliant idea. I think we could be an interested party in that, potentially. Maybe I could just, I think, unless I see any more questions, and I don't see any, maybe I could ask you all to unmute yourselves and give a very warm round of applause to Eleanor for a fantastic talk. And may I just end by saying we're trying to put together our next event for next month, which hopefully would be a walk around the Lowther Castle gardens with the head gardener, Martin Ogle. I'm having a call with him tomorrow. We've foreseen a date of the 4th of August for that, but it all depends a little bit on COVID and how it all works out. But so when I finally follow up a message to all of you who've been on this call, I will give you more details of that. I'm talking about it with him tomorrow. So no more ado. Thank you very much indeed again to Eleanor. Thank you all for listening in, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the evening and weekend coming up.